A damning UN report warning of certain devastation from climate change has been dubbed by environmentalists as humanity's final wake-up call. The Maldives is among the countries at serious risk from climate change. On our program today, we will be discussing the UN report with the Maldives Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology, Aminat Shauna, and the UN Resident Coordinator in Sri Lanka, Hannah Singer. Also on our program, we will be looking at the COVID situation in Australia, and joining us from Sydney will be journalist Shehan Fernando. Hello and welcome. I'm Iswaran Ratnam, and this is Daily Mirror World Focus. The UN's IPCC has released a very anticipated report warning of the impact of climate change. The Maldives is among the countries at grave risk from climate change. There are fears in the years to come the Maldives may actually go underwater. Joining me from the Maldives is the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology, Aminat Shauna. Also joining us from the UN office in Colombo is the UN Resident Coordinator to Sri Lanka, Ms. Hannah Singer. Ms. Singer, let me start with you. This report gives the impression that most countries have not really taken environment protection seriously. Is it too late right now?
Thank you, Iswaran, for having me on the program to discuss this important report. Very pleased to be here, really. Now, according to the report, escape from human-caused climate change is no longer possible. Climate change is now affecting every continent, every region, and every ocean on Earth, and every facet of the weather. However, there is still time to avert the worst damage if humanity chooses to. And to go back to your question, the purpose of the report is to highlight that we are at a turning point. We can make changes now, or we can suffer dire consequences. For example, because of greenhouse emissions from human activities, in the next 20 years, global temperature is anticipated to approach or exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade. Carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere were greater in 2019 than they had been in at least 2 million years. Another point is that the concentration of methane and nitrous oxide were higher than at any time in the last 800,000 years. So you can imagine the magnitude of the crisis that we are in. But we say this, but we say also that we still have a chance to stop the negative climate trend by limiting the use of fossil fuels and by stopping deforestation. So the world needs to make deep carbon pollution cuts now. And we need to see an end to coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet and destroy humanity. There must be no new coal plants built after 2021. We need to see developed countries phasing out existing coal by 2030, with all countries doing the same by 2040. Countries should also end all new fossil fuel exploration and production and shift fossil fuel subsidies into renewable energy. By 2030, solar and wind capacity should increase by 4 times, and renewable energy investments should triple if we are to safeguard the future of our planet, and I underline this very strongly. We have not lost hope, and we can still take action to limit the impacts of our action on the planet.
What are the countries that are at grave risk from the impact of climate change?
Thank you for the question. Now, climate change impacts every part of the world, and we need every single country to play a role in mitigating the impact of human activity on the planet. We are seeing, we have seen and you are seeing record-breaking temperatures, drought and forest fires, and just this year in the Mediterranean, Russia and North America, and who can forget the terrible fires that happened in Australia last year. So global warming means more water vapor in the atmosphere, and this has led to severe flooding, for example, in Europe and in China. Now, the warming of the oceans has also affected the frequency, intensity, and the locations of tropical storms. So there is no location on Earth where we can escape the impact of climate change. Now, the report doesn't specify countries. However, for South Asian region, it notes that heat waves and humid heat stress will be more intense and frequent. So the second point is that both annual and summer monsoon precipitation will increase, which means increase in rainfall as well. Now, in the wider Asian region, the report also says that the relative sea level around Asia has increased faster than the global average, with coastal area loss and shoreline retreat. Another point is that the regional mean sea level will also continue to rise. Now, what does this mean for us here in Sri Lanka? Now, sea level rise, coastal erosion, increasing water temperatures, and the high acidity can have significant implications for marine ecosystems, which most coastal communities depend on. So, those who are most at risk with climate change are those with limited capacity to cope. This is highly dependent on the level of economic development. So, livelihood sources of the poor are usually narrower and more climate sensitive. So, extreme weather events, which would cause limited damage and few casualties in a developed country, often cause extensive damage and substantial loss of life in a developing country.
Minister Shauna, let me turn to you now. What sort of short and long-term impact do you see on the Maldives from climate change?
Climate change is an existential threat for the Maldives, and the climate emergency that has been confirmed by the most recent IPCC report really proves that it continues to be an existential threat for the Maldives. 80% of our islands are just less than 1 meter above sea level, and we don't have a higher ground to run to. Over 90% of the islands reported flooding annually, and 97% of the islands report shoreline erosion. 64% of the islands experience severe erosion. Nearly 50% of the housing structures are also within just 100 meters from the coastline. Therefore, most islands cannot withstand tidal floods, let alone tsunamis. Our income, our food, and our survival depends on these vulnerabilities.
Has the Maldives taken any serious steps to protect itself from climate change?
The government has world-leading policies to address the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. We have the world's most sustainable fisheries. There's a lot that we can do to protect environment and ensure that we turn the climate threat into an opportunity. We can shift our economy from running on diesel to running on sunshine. In this regard, the Maldives has a very ambitious target to reach net zero emissions by 2030. We also have a policy to protect 20% of our marine resources by 2030. We have started this process and we are already implementing some of these policies. We have policies to phase out single-use plastics by 2023, and these are world-leading policies that we have taken up to address the impacts of climate change.
So what kind of support would the Maldives expect from its South Asian neighbors in the battle against climate change?
Science is so clear. World leaders, negotiators, donors, and other funding agencies, we are all gearing up to be part of COP26 and to make COP26 a success. Therefore, the Maldives really looks forward to support from our South Asian neighbors and friends to make this a successful COP. It's not just the Maldives that's being affected by climate change. It's no longer an issue of small island nations and coastal areas. Therefore, we really look forward to the support from our South Asian neighbors and friends to put all their efforts to have ambitious targets to keep to prevent a planet warming and to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees.
Ms. Singer, what role has the UN played to push for policy changes to protect the environment?
Yes, of course, the UN has been extensively implicated and involved in this area. So most recently, for example, the 2019 Climate Action Summit to increase and accelerate climate action and ambition. So the summit focused on key sectors where action can make the most difference. Then there is the iconic Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, where there were three areas really of agreement. The first was to substantially reducing global greenhouse gas emissions to limit the global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, while also pushing to limit it to 1.5 degrees. The second point was reviews countries' commitment every 5 years. And the third agreement was to provide financing to developing countries to mitigate climate change, strengthen the resilience, and enhance capacities to adapt to climate action. There is also another very critical protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, that was agreed on in 1995, which legally binds developed country parties to emission reduction targets. And then we have the Earth Summit, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, what we call the UNFCCC, that was agreed on in 1992. This was a predecessor to the Paris Agreement, and it aimed to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system.
Now, you represent the UN in Sri Lanka. What sort of expectations does the UN have for Sri Lanka as far as making changes to policies when it comes to environmental issues?
Yes, enhancing resilience to climate change and disasters and strengthening environmental management is absolutely a very critical component of our four main objectives of the UN strategic plan in Sri Lanka, and will be also a core in the new country program. Now, we work in partnership with the government, civil society, environmentalists, communities, and a host of other stakeholders to come up together with feasible solutions. Now, Sri Lanka has made some very good commitments in the past few years, and the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy focuses on both adaptation and disaster risk management. So, for example, Sri Lanka has communicated updated and more ambitious nationally determined contributions to UNFCCC in achieving the set targets of the Paris Agreement in a local context. Sri Lanka also spearheaded the Colombo Declaration on Sustainable Nitrogen Management in 2019, and the declaration was endorsed by the United Nations member state as a proposed roadmap for action on nitrogen challenges. Now, there are various changes that can be made across sectors. So let me give you just a few examples. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. So let me start, for example, by energy. We must promote renewable energy technologies in place of the fossil fuel-fired plants wherever they are technologically and economically feasible. The second area is prevention of waste through sustainable waste management and the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste. In agriculture, for example, we need climate-smart agricultural techniques. There is a need to promote conservation farming techniques and to make farmers aware of climate change and different adaptation options. And now, for example, for coastal conservation, there is a need to delineate critical areas and prepare to develop a special integrated coastal zone management plan. building on post-COVID-19 green economy by engaging partners and stakeholders. Now, all of the areas I mentioned, many of our UN agencies are working in these areas in partnership with, as I mentioned, definitely in partnership with the government, civil society, the environmentalists, and communities.
Thank you, Ms. Singer, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me on the program, Iswaran. And in wrapping up, my message is that we are at a critical juncture. As the Secretary General has called it, a code red of humanity. However, hope is not lost. We can still turn things around or at least mitigate our damage to the planet. But this requires accelerating our efforts and working together now in solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, as the coronavirus continues to have a serious impact on a number of countries, even countries that were on the road to recovery have been affected. Australia is one of those countries. Joining us from Sydney, Australia is Shehan Fernando to give us an update on the latest situation in Australia. Shehan, what is the latest situation in Australia right now?
Hey Iswaran, thank you very much for having me on your show. So the situation in Australia is becoming very delicate. A lot of changes, restrictions, and now a bit of uncertainty brought into the lives of everyday Australians. You might find this strange, but this was not the case for us here in Sydney until June, when the Delta variant crept into Sydney. Now, that being said, we have, of course, seen the approach in Australia in comparison to other countries being a bit different. Even with just a handful of cases, a couple, you'll find Australia and leaders in certain parts of the country going in for these snap lockdowns straight away. Very evident even this week with the capital of Australia, Canberra, the capital Australian territory. We saw just a handful of cases identified. The same day, lockdowns, a snap lockdown brought in to ensure the spread is controlled, contained, and hopefully eliminated. This has been the strategy with many territories and states. Melbourne, Daniel Andrews, who's the Premier, in, of course, Victoria, as well as in Queensland, Brisbane, we have a Premier by the name of Anastasia Palaszczuk. Both Premiers have followed more or less the same mechanism in dealing with the COVID crisis or the situation. And their approach, snap lockdowns, which have been very common in these two states. Now, while talking about those two states, New South Wales, where you get Sydney, has followed a rather strange or different approach until the Delta variant came into the picture. We hardly had any lockdowns. The approach has always been in Sydney to keep the economy going forward, which is what the Premier Gladys Berejiklian has followed. Now, this unfortunately was challenged since June when the Delta variant crept into Sydney, and life as you know it has changed with the number of cases escalating on a daily basis. Looking at this week alone, over 300 cases on a more or less daily basis reported, with a number of deaths also between 1 and 5 unfortunately confirmed. So how exactly is Australia dealing with the situation currently? Now, in Sydney, what they do is they break it into local government areas. If you live in an area where there are a lot of cases, then the restrictions are harder. If you live in an area with less COVID cases or no COVID cases, the freedom is extended to a certain degree. It's not exactly a lockdown. They call it a stay-at-home order. And if you're in one of those challenged local government areas, you only get a 5-kilometer radius to go out, buy your groceries, get back. Only one person is permitted to do the shopping at a time. Likewise, to exercise, you can go out, again, people that live together, but inside basically that 5-kilometer radius. So that technically is the approach. Masks, in short, encouraged no matter where you are in Australia, but the requirement The laws around them could vary depending on where you live and the areas that you would be visiting. Likewise, if you violate these given rules and regulations, you're also looking at a possible fine, a lot of fines that could be introduced or that most definitely would be introduced. So it is very important that you follow the COVID regulations on a daily basis to make sure that you know first and foremost what you are permitted, allowed to do. So that is basically how life is currently in Australia.
How did things get out of hand, especially in Sydney?
Now, that's a very good question, Iswaran. So, before we take a look at the possible reasons or what, caused this situation, let's try to identify when the Delta variant got into the picture, because that's where it all started. So, according to available information, on the 16th of June, a limo driver transporting international flight crew is recorded as the first person in Sydney or New South Wales to get the Delta variant. After he got it, then it moved to the eastern suburbs and then eventually started to spread. Now, once it was identified that the Delta variant is evident or present in New South Wales, the medical advice, as expected from the experts to the government in New South Wales, was to go in for a hard and fast lockdown soon as possible to avoid unnecessary issues like we've seen all around the world. But this is where the first obstacle comes in. The New South Wales government, as I mentioned earlier, are firm believers in keeping the economy going forward and dealing with the COVID situation with restrictions, tough restrictions, but not exactly lockdowns, or at least that's what they believed initially. So because of this clash initially, we really didn't get into a lockdown or, even a stay-at-home order for that matter. That gap, a lot believe, gave room for the Delta variant to spread, and a lot believe that is where we kind of dropped the ball. Now, while saying that, the New South Wales government also brought in a lot of tough, strict regulations, restrictions to limit movement to only essential work. This opens another avenue that supermarkets, which are still open, as well as essential work and workers, were then responsible for spreading the virus. Now, that opens another problem, because the younger population, if you look at 20s to 40-year-olds or 20s to 49-year-olds, most of them were not fully vaccinated at that time as a result of a delay in the vaccine rollout in this part of the world. On top of that, we had another problem. AstraZeneca is heavily promoted, freely available in Australia, and encouraged by all authorities to get jabbed. But AstraZeneca had a few complications connecting the younger population of Australia. While Pfizer was very much in demand, it was not freely available. Even now, if you want to get Pfizer, you got to be on a list, and also you got to meet certain criteria to be eligible to get the Pfizer jab. So, as a result of these issues, a lot believe there was a delay, and these indirectly or directly have contributed to the present situation New South Wales is in.
There have been protests in Australia, especially in Sydney, against imposing a lockdown. Why are people protesting when this may actually help them contain the spread of the virus?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy if you think about it, isn't it? I mean, you would expect the developed world to act in a responsible manner in the middle of a pandemic, but clearly that was not the case. And you should not be surprised. Now, looking at Europe, the Middle East, North America, we've seen countries, groups, sometimes violently protesting against governments over lockdowns. And according to the information we have from certain experts, the economic situation has contributed immensely. Some people completely losing their jobs, their income, while some not enjoying the same financial benefits they would have in a COVID-free or lockdown-free environment. Now, keep in mind, the government in this part of the world, they are assisting people who can prove that they have been financially impacted due to a lockdown. So in spite of that, some still do not want to come to terms with the realities and getting frustrated over the situation and finding more people that fall into the same category has clearly been one of the contributing factors. On top of that, it was highlighted that certain elements, groups have been exploiting these uncertainties that people are going through, and with misinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, and then you also get the anti-vaxxers who've got their act going through social media, convincing people with what they believe in. We've also found out that there's been a few international organizations, some based in Germany, the worldwide demonstration that has been assisting these people that do not want to agree to lockdowns, and they've been organizing these rallies globally, including the ones we've seen here in Sydney. So yeah, it's a pretty crazy world, but you get people who believe different things, and at the end of the day, I guess it's your responsibility as an individual to go through the available information and make a decision based on what is available. So that's something we can't really do much about, but yeah, these things do happen even here in Sydney.
Thank you, Shehan. And that's all the time we have for you on this program. Do join us again for another World Focus. This is Daily Mirror.